Welcome to Heroku Superpowers. I know it's early. Appreciate you all coming out. Today we're going to talk about Heroku. I'm going to go through a bunch of tips and tricks that you can use while working on Heroku to boost your team's productivity. So before we get to that, who am I? I'm Mike Coutermarsh. I'm a software engineer. I live here in San Francisco. I work on high-growth web applications, so various startups around the San Francisco area. If you want to find me on Twitter, it's MS, and then 4 Cs. That's because 2 and 3 Cs were taken. If you want to get in touch later, my email and website are there. And if you find that you like the tips today, I write about this kind of stuff all the time. A couple years ago, I wrote a book that's just full of tips on using Heroku. You can find it on Amazon. So real quick refresher, if you walked in and you're not familiar with what Heroku is, what I like to tell people is Heroku is a platform as a service for deploying, managing, and scaling web applications. So Heroku's focus is on developer happiness. So things that might be difficult or tedious to do in sort of a normal ops environment, Heroku makes it easy, so developers love them. What I generally tell people, I work in startups throughout San Francisco, is that when you're on a small team and you're using Heroku instead of implementing your ops directly, it typically saves you about 1 engineer per year. So going with Heroku tends to be a little bit more expensive than, say, if you implement directly on AWS, but you save an entire engineer's time over the year, so that's where your cost savings are. And then with startups, we generally like to spend our time on building features rather than configuring servers. Then my final note here, if you haven't used Heroku before, it's Polyglot, so works with almost any stack. Personally, I tend to deploy Ruby and Node apps, but if you use Java or PHP, Go, you'll be able to deploy to Heroku. So a lot of what I'm going to share with you today, I learned while working on producthunt.com. If you're not familiar with Product Hunt, Product Hunt is the best place to find your favorite new thing. So every day, people come to Product Hunt to share, discuss, and upvote the latest in tech. So we're a very high traffic web application and also API. Personally, we deploy Polyglot environments, so React, Ruby, Rails, Node. And I just checked a couple days ago, we're using 14 separate Heroku applications to serve producthunt.com. So we're heavy Heroku users, and we have a lot of experience. Another note, we also host the API, which is the backend for our iPhone app on Heroku. So we're a distributed team. There's 9 engineers and designers at Product Hunt, and we're working across 5 different time zones. So we have a heavy focus on our tools. They must be good. Because often when I'm sleeping, the rest of the team might be working. All right, so we'll get into the superpowers. This talk, I'm going to show you 3 of my favorite superpowers that I've learned over the years working with Heroku. I've been using Heroku in production for a bunch of high-traffic web apps since it was in beta. So I've learned quite a few tricks along the way. I'm going to share with you my favorites today. So, superpower number 1. This is embrace the CLI. So the CLI stands for Command Line Interface. If you're not familiar with this, what you can do is pop open a terminal on your laptop, and all of you have access to one of these. If you're using Windows, Linux, or Mac, you'll have access to the Heroku CLI. So one thing that I learned early on when working with Heroku is that everything that you can do through the Heroku dashboard is also available through the CLI. So if you find yourself spending time clicking around the dashboard, whatever you're doing there can often be accomplished with just a single command through the CLI. So this is going to save you a lot of time when you're using this throughout the day. So here's just an example. A really common task on Heroku is adding a collaborator to your app. So if you want to do this, you have to log into the dashboard, navigate to your app, and then go in and type in your friend's email address to add them so that they can work on this application with you. if I knew how to use the CLI, I can go through all of those steps instead with just this one simple line. I type that out, I press enter, and the person receives an invite. So the command is Heroku access add, and then the person's email address. So if you just saw that and you're like, I've never used a command line interface, I have no interest in touching this, no, this is not for me, I'm going to teach you how to remember all of this stuff. So one little secret that many people don't know about using the CLI is you don't need to memorize all the commands. There's a common pattern. If you remember the pattern, the rest is pretty straightforward. So today, I don't want you to remember any of the commands I'm going to show you. Just remember the pattern, and then you'll be able to do this on your own. So it works like this. There's 3 parts to every command: Heroku, which is the CLI, the name of the command, and then any options that you pass to it. So if we look at our example of adding a collaborator from before, follows that pattern. But how did I know what that command was in the first place? So one useful trick that a lot of people don't know is that the CLI is fully documented. And you can access all of this documentation from within the CLI itself. So you don't have to open a browser or Google or navigate around Stack Overflow to figure it out. Everything's already in your terminal for you if you just know how to use it. So I'll show you real quick. This is the only command that you ever need to remember. Heroku help. Got it? Heroku help. So when you type in Heroku help, this is what happens. You'll see on the left, you'll get a list of all of the commands available in the CLI. You'll see that a lot of these match up with everything you can do in the dashboard. And then on the right, you can see what those commands map to. So if you see there, we can see access, which we used before to manage user access to apps. So in addition to Heroku help, if you want to drill down into a specific command, you can use Heroku help and then the command. So let's go back to our access example. If I type Heroku help access, we can see here, it gives me examples on how to use it. So I never looked this up. I typed Heroku help access, and I looked at the example for how to use it. All right, so next up, I'm going to show you my all-time favorite time-saving trick using the CLI. It's just one, and a lot of people don't know this one. So on Heroku, add-ons are really popular. So they give you additional functionality to your application. My favorite add-on on Heroku is New Relic. So it will give you performance information for your app. I find that I'm in and out of New Relic all day long checking on my application. So when I need to use New Relic, what a lot of people will do is they'll open the dashboard, navigate to the app, click on New Relic, and then you're logged in, or maybe you forgot your login. Anyway, what I do is this one command: Heroku add-ons open New Relic. And what it does as soon as you press enter, launches a browser, and you're already logged into New Relic. So it saves you a lot of time. Say New Relic's not your favorite. This works with any add-on. Here's an example of if you want to open Olibrato very quickly. So in summary, embrace the CLI. Remember, you don't have to remember all of the commands. What you have to do is learn the pattern, and then remember how to use Heroku help. All right, superpower number 2, autoscaling. So if you have a popular web app, when it comes to handling traffic spikes, I've found that there's typically 2 ways that a lot of teams handle this. So the first is they will way over provision the amount of servers that they need. So imagine their typical traffic only requires 2 servers, but they just constantly run 10 just in case they're featured on a web article. This approach is very effective, right? You're always prepared for a spike, but it's very expensive. So then the second method that people tend to scale their applications is they'll try to anticipate traffic spikes. So imagine tomorrow morning you know that your startup's going to be featured on TechCrunch. The night before, you'll scale up, add a bunch of servers, then the next morning you're prepared. When the TechCrunch traffic dies down, you scale back down. Now the problem with this is you're relying on humans to scale for you, and you can't always anticipate what's going to happen. reason I really like autoscaling is a few years ago, I was working on a startup, and we were featured on lifehacker.com. If you remember, being featured on Lifehacker a few years ago was kind of the biggest thing that could happen for a startup, and it brought you a ton of traffic. So at that time, we were a small team. I remember I was driving in the middle of nowhere of like upstate New York. I had no internet connection. I was getting texted that you're on Lifehacker, and we had autoscaling set up, so our app just started adding more servers, was able to handle the traffic, and we stayed up. So one rule that I'd like to share with you, and I like to share this with all engineering teams, is if a robot can do it, a robot should do it. So if you have things that humans are doing and you're relying on a human to do something, but you could have automated that, you should probably automate it. And we can apply this rule here to scaling when using Heroku. So autoscaling. It's available in the Heroku dashboard now. And the way it works is this. Heroku will scale out. So what scale out means is adds more servers. And you see here it says dynos. Web server and dyno mean the same thing on Heroku. So when I say dyno, that means a web server. And what autoscaling does is scales out when you need more servers, and then scales in, meaning reducing the number of servers. And it does this based on your application's response time. So it gives you a few settings, and it's pretty simple to set up. So first setting that you'll need to do is the minimum number of dynos. So this is the minimum amount of web servers that you want running at a time. I recommend you always have at least 2, because it's the internet and redundancy is good. And then as far as maximum, you might be tempted to just crank this up to 100, but I'm going to warn you here, you need to make sure that you've run your app at this amount of servers before you set the maximum to this. Because with scaling, there's nothing magic. There's a lot of downstream implications of running this many servers in production. Like for example, if you've never run 10 dynos before, but you have a limit on your database connections, that could bring you down instead of the traffic. And then your final setting is the 95th percentile request time. So this is some of your slowest requests that your app is serving and how quickly it's responding. And this is the time that Heroku monitors for scaling your app out and in. If you don't know what to set this to, Heroku looks at your past performance and will give you a suggestion on what they think will work well. What I recommend doing here is use whatever Heroku suggests, and then monitor it for the first week and kind of see how it works, and then you can make your own adjustments from there. So here's what it looks like in the dashboard. You can see here, I'm setting my minimum and maximum number of dynos. And then next, you'll set your response time. From there, you press confirm, and it's enabled. So a little more info before you go enable this. It's currently limited to performance or private dynos. There's alternatives to autoscaling. You can look up HireFire, which is one I've used and had a lot of success with. And then kind of my biggest thing for you to remember is it's not magic. Web servers are just a single part of the equation when it comes to handling a high traffic website. You have to be aware of all the downstream resources that you're also affecting, such as your database. Another one is autoscaling doesn't work well with sudden spikes. A startup I used to work with would often have TV commercials during primetime television. So as you can imagine, what happens when you're on a TV commercial, comes on, everyone who sees it pulls out their phone, navigates to the app, and then within 10 seconds, you have this huge spike of traffic. With autoscaling, the problem is autoscaling is not going to respond quick enough in those 10 seconds to save you. So in a case like that, you need to know this is going to happen in advance and have that minimum number of dynos set high enough to handle the traffic spike. And then finally, I said this before, this is not like a set it and forget it thing right away. I recommend setting it up and then just watching it for a week or so to see how it responds to your traffic, and then make little adjustments so it works best for your application. There's no one size fits all. All right, so that was autoscaling. Finally, we're at superpower number 3. This is one of my all-time favorites for working on a team, especially if you use Slack, which I think a lot of people use. I'm going to show you how to use this tool called Olibrato to set up automatic alerts. And what it does is it allows your team to know when things are starting to go wrong so you can act fast. OK, so for every web app, there are generally a few different things that I like to monitor on a regular basis. So for me personally, I like to keep tabs on the memory usage of the application, CPU usage, and the number of database connections I'm using. So if I'm doing this manually, what happens if I forget? Or say, what if someone on my team deploys a change that affects one of these metrics? So maybe some new code went into production, and it suddenly spikes the memory usage on our dynos. This is where automatic alerting comes in. What it will do is it will send your team a Slack message whenever a threshold that you set up is crossed. So you know immediately when something might be going wrong. So once you set up Olibrato, you'll get a dashboard that looks something like this. This is just an example of some of the metrics you get. There's a bunch more, and you can set up custom ones. But what we're looking at here is how quickly is our application responding, how much memory are our dynos using. And what you can do with any of these metrics is set up high and low thresholds, and whenever one of those gets crossed, you'll get a notification right away. So here's an example of a Olibrato notification or alert going off in our Slack room. We like to monitor the load average on our dynos, and this particular dyno's load average was above 7 for 5 minutes, so we got an alert right away so that we knew to look into that. Here's some examples of sort of things that you can set up and that I recommend setting up. So database connections, say you have a limit of 500 connections on your database. You never want that scenario where you've added so many dynos and now some of them can't connect to your database and they'll just be throwing 500s to users. So I like to know in advance when we start to get up towards those limits. So if you're at 500, you could set a threshold for 300 and you'll get alerted. Dyno-free memory is important with web applications. You never want to be going into swap. You want RAM because that's fast for serving web requests. Always good to know when you get to those limits. And then some others, a CPU load I showed you before, and then if your web app's starting to get slow. All right, that's it. So those are my 3 superpowers. Number 1, learn to use the CLI. So remember the pattern and Heroku help. If you do that, you'll become super productive. You won't have to use the dashboard. Number 2, if a robot can do it, let a robot do it. Don't rely on humans to do something as important as scale your web app. And then finally, set up automatic alerts. So you always know in advance when something might go wrong. We don't have time today for questions, but if you want to get in touch, my Twitter and email are up here. If you want a copy of these slides, they're up on my website at /Heroku-superpowers. Thank you.